Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of the Roster Review series with a look into the Montreal Alouettes, a team that made some major strides as a franchise in 2019, making the playoffs for the first time I think it was 5 years. I'm really excited to talk about them today, and without further ado, let's just get into today's schedule. So we'll go over the position rankings first. By the time you've seen this, you probably know how this goes. We'll rank every position on this team 1 to 9, where they rank in the CFL, and then we'll go over the projected starter/ratio possibilities, where they're going to start their Canadians this season, which is a very interesting discussion as we'll talk about later with this team. And then I'll go into my award predictions, most outstanding player, all that. And then finally, I'll give my final thoughts on the Montreal Alouettes going into this season. And as a reminder, there are timestamps in the description, so if you want to skip forward to a particular part of the video, there you go. So first, we'll start off with the positional rankings, and again, the quarterback position is super deep this year at the CFL level, at least in terms of starters. And this is a case in point because I love Vernon Adams. He's probably my favorite player in the CFL. I just think he's the most entertaining player in the league right now, and just the way he brought life back into the Montreal Alouettes franchise in 2019, and how he was kind of hyped coming into the league as a guy that a lot of people thought was an ideal fit for the Canadian game as kind of an undersized quarterback but had the great improvisational ability. And despite that, they're going to rank 6th in the CFL. It's not that I don't like them, it's just that there are a lot of other players that I kind of have to give due to first. Him and Cody Fajardo, very hard to rank this year in terms of these guys that broke out during the 2019 season while we had all these quarterback injuries. Very hard to rank the quarterbacks this year, but 6th, don't pay too much attention to that ranking because he's a starting caliber quarterback that not necessarily the best processor at this stage. He struggles sometimes with his accuracy, but in terms of just the playmaking ability, avoiding sacks, keeping his eyes down the field, and just making plays for this offense. Just super effective player. Really an MVP candidate this season. And then beyond that, the quarterback room is kind of shaky. So you have Matthew Schultz, who's the backup, who's been here since 2017 in a backup capacity, and he's really looked shaky at best when he has seen action, so we'll have to see how he figures that out. Let's see if he makes the roster here. He might be in for a big camp battle here. And then Darius James Peterson out of Idaho, extremely productive running quarterback when in college, while not being really as developed as a passer. We've seen guys like this have success with creative coaching in the CFL. Think of Chris Streveler as recently as 2019 with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. So keep an eye on him. Might be an interesting developmental prospect there for the Alouettes. Brock Reuter from North Central was signed for the 2020 season by the San Francisco 49ers, but the league shortened rosters for training camp, and he never really got another shot in the league, so disappointing to say the least. So this is really his first taste of pro action, and he's actually the all-time leader in Division III passing yards, fun fact. And then Chris Robinson from Florida Atlantic, a former Oklahoma recruit before transferring to Florida Atlantic, where he broke some single-season school records. However, he was dismissed from the team in 2020, having previously been suspended twice. So maybe there's some discipline issues there, but he gets a shot here with the Alouettes to try to earn a backup role. Now let's move on to the running back room, where they're going to rank 2nd in the CFL, and that's really all because of William Stanback, the starting running back here. Just a dynamic running back that really just broke onto the scene in 2019 as a CFL star. Maybe not the guy that's the fastest in terms of lateral agility, but the power is just outstanding. He just powers through arm tackle, and the straight line speed, once this guy gets going, it's dynamic. And you can dump the ball off to him, and he can make some plays in the passing game as well, but maybe that's not the best part of his game. But he is just such an effective runner of the football, arguably the best runner of the football in the CFL, dare I say, just based on the 2019 film. So we'll see how he follows that up. He actually got signed after the 2019 season by the the Las Vegas Raiders, and then he gets cut and comes back here to Montreal without even missing a game. So I'm excited that they got him back in the fold. And then Cameron Artis-Payne is the most notable of these backups here. Former 5th round pick of the Carolina Panthers, where he spent 4 seasons. And he most recently played for the Dallas Renegades of the XFL. and he's probably the most likely backup out of this group because he has so much pro experience. And then Dominic Bragaloni out of Lehigh, his first taste of professional football, as he never really received anything beyond an invite to spring minicamp in the NFL, was supposed to be on the team's 2020 roster, but of course we didn't have a season, so he finally gets that chance at professional football here. And then a couple Canadian guys in Colton Clausen and Jeshurun Antwi. Clausen, a smaller guy at 5'8", who will likely need to find a role on special teams because I don't see much of a route here for playing time for a Canadian running back in this offense. And then Antwi, a 6th round pick in 2019, and will be going into his rookie season after a stellar career with the Calgary Dinos. So really excited to see how he develops in his CFL career. But a lot of these guys, back-end Canadians, the roster, that's all about making it on special teams first and foremost. So keep an eye on that. And then Taku Lee, a guy that was selected in this year's CFL Global Draft. So we'll see if he's the global player that they keep on the roster. Remember, they only can keep one global player this season in the CFL after the roster requirements were shifted due to this amended season. Now, at the wide receiver position, this is where I might ruffle some feathers here. They're only going to rank 7th, and this is not a slight to them because this is actually an outstanding unit. There's so many great wide receiving groups in the CFL right now. Trying to rank them really tough. The reason why I just don't put them above a lot of other groups in the league is because they just don't have that guy that really strikes fear into you. The best receiver in this unit is Eugene Lewis. They just have a lot of really solid receivers that all bring something to the table. It's a very deep wide receiver unit, as we'll talk about in this section, but there's just not that really great number one receiver that scares you. We'll start with Eugene Lewis, who really is their number one receiver in this offense, but just doesn't excel at any one thing. A big-bodied receiver, had a very good chemistry with Vernon Adams in 2019 and was productive, but just not a very dynamic in terms of creating those big plays and such. BJ Cunningham, productive CFL vet, who the only thing with him is really just staying healthy. He only played in, I think it was 6 games in 2019, but has been a very productive receiver throughout his CFL career. And then Naman Roosevelt, one of my favorite players on this team. He signed in 2020 free agency, coming over from Saskatchewan, been in the league for a while, has a couple of 1,000-yard receiving seasons under his belt. Just been a very productive receiver throughout his career. What I will say about him is I think he's really going to help this team, particularly on second down when they need those second down conversions. He's just very effective in terms of the route running in that short to intermediate game that can help this offense continue to move the chains on a more consistent basis. Because this team in 2019, very dependent on the big play. And then Quan Bray, a very interesting case because he had some off-field troubles this offseason. So he comes to camp late here, but he's officially in camp now as of the recording of this video. And he had a great rookie season in 2019, looked explosive, had about a handful of touchdowns, just a very effective player in his time on the field. So we'll see how he follows it up as potentially this offense's breakthrough wide receiver in this unit. But again, the off-field troubles kind of worry you if that comes back into play here. And then Jake Weineke, really great chemistry with Vernon Adams in 2019. Caught a bunch of touchdowns, was really effective in the red zone. Not necessarily the most explosive receiver in the world, but really good chemistry with Vernon Adams and just knows how to get open. And then Dante Absher, a guy that broke onto the scene late in the 2019 season, even had a handful of catches in the playoff game against Edmonton. Really excited to see if he can find a role as a starter here in 2021. And then you have a trio of former XFL players here in Nelson Spruce, Rashad Ross, and Eli Rogers. Ross and Rogers actually played both for the DC Defenders of the XFL, and then Nelson Spruce played for the LA Wildcats. Spruce was the most productive of the three in the XFL and was arguably one of the league's best receivers, actually. And then Ross, more of a kick returner type that spent a lot of time in the NFL, most notably with Washington. And we'll see if he factors in as a return man, potentially. Eli Rogers, his best moments in the NFL came with the Pittsburgh Steelers as kind of a slot receiver that had some decent production in the short time he did spend there. And then moving on to the two Canadians that are in this unit, Keon Julian Grant was a 2019 second-round pick, a very fast receiver that made one reception in 2019. We'll see if he gets onto the field for more playing time, but just the fact that he actually did get onto the field at a point in the 2019 season as a rookie, pretty decent sign there that maybe they're considering him as a starter in the future. And then Rashad Simonized, that a receiver that's been around for a little bit in the league. He played for BC in 2019, not an effective tenure with them, dropped a lot of passes when he did see opportunities, so we'll see if he can redeem himself, but he was getting open. It was just he was not taking advantage of those opportunities, but we'll see if he gets a redemption arc in a pretty weak national receiving group for the Montreal Alouettes. Now, in the offensive line, they're going to rank 7th, and I have some major concerns with this offensive line after the retirements of Trey Rutherford. That was early in the offseason when he decided to retire to become a firefighter, I believe. And he was probably their best upcoming young lineman at the left guard position. And then Jason Lazon-Sagan, who is a right tackle assigned from Ottawa, was supposed to be one of their projected starters at tackle. Now it's kind of up in the air at that position, so pretty concerning in that regard. But let's go on to the guys that are here, with Tony Washington, easily this unit's best offensive lineman in my opinion. Locks down that left tackle position. He's been in the league for a while. Very steady. He's not going to have a lot of games that he gives up high pressure totals. And then Christian Matt, who is named this team's most outstanding offensive lineman the last time we saw this team play. A veteran guy that doesn't really excel at the physical aspect of the game, doesn't really provide a lot of push at that center position, but just a really good vet that communicates well, keeps this line together. Very effective player in terms of the pass protection aspect, which is frankly just more important. And then Sean Jamieson and Philippe Gagnon, two guys that have had middling success as guards throughout their career. Jamieson had some decent film in 2019, and Gagnon was just kind of a fill-in sometimes for Ottawa in 2019. He actually comes back to the team after spending the first few years with the Alouettes as a first-round pick of the team, and then spent 2019 with Ottawa. So we'll see if he makes an appearance as a starter on this offensive line. And then David Foucault, another guy that I'm just not that high on, has a lot of CFL experience over the past 3 seasons, but wasn't very effective at times with BC. He had one particular game. I was looking at my offensive line grades where I was like recording pressures and sacks and whatnot, and he had one brutal game when he was playing left guard for the BC Lions in 2019. Not that I'm going to hold him to the fire just based on one game, but it was one of the worst recorded games I did in the 2019 season for the guard position. But he's also a guy that has some experience playing some tackle, both guard positions. So we'll see how he figures into this offense. I think he probably ends up being a starter just based on their ratio situation, and especially with Jason Lazon-Sagan retiring. And then they bring Chris Schluger back, a guy that started at tackle, another guy I just wasn't that impressed with. Gave up a lot of high pressure games, just made a lot of mistakes in pass protection. So they bring him back just before training camp here, but I'm interested to see where they decide to go with this tackle position, as we'll discuss later on. And then David Brown, I forgot to put an asterisk there. He is a Canadian lineman. He most recently played in the Spring League, so a guy that has some recent film on him that just got picked up. And we'll see if he, reinvigorates his career here in this Montreal Alouettes offense. There's plenty of opportunities for it, as I've just discussed. And then Landon Rice, kind of veteran insurance here, has been in the league for a long time. Hasn't started a ton of games in recent years, so we'll see how he does. And then Cole Boozer and Nick Callender, two American guys that could figure in here. There's not much to say about those guys. We'll see if they break into this roster, and with the depth that they have here, it's quite possible. Now at the defensive line position, another position that I don't want you guys to just focus on the ranking here, because I actually do think this defensive line made some massive strides this offseason. They're going to rank 6th, but I think that they're much better than the ones below them. So Armando Sewell is the big addition here. He, in my opinion, is the best defensive lineman in the CFL, even at his advanced age now. Such a force on the inside. He's going to really push the pocket. As I said in my recent Edmonton Elks video, if they had him on the roster still, I think Edmonton would have had the best defensive line in the CFL. This was such a massive offseason addition, and really kept the offseason from being not a disaster, but kind of a disappointment for the Alouettes. So that was a huge addition. I think he's going to be the heart and soul of this defense like he was in Edmonton, just being that force. And he's going to make an impact on everybody around him, going to force double teams, going to be that type of force on the inside that really makes a difference to this defense. And then Nick Usher, a guy that had production in 2019, and as a result, he actually got a contract in the NFL. I had some issues with his discipline in 2019 with Edmonton. One thing I didn't really make an emphasis about in their video was how undisciplined they were. A lot of roughing the passer penalties, and Nick Usher, one of the main reasons for it. Just a lot of bad penalties that put the team in bad position. But he is a talented player, and if he can clean that up, he's going to be a very effective defensive end for this team and be an upgrade on what they had last season. Woody Barron, Michael Wakefield, those two guys I could see competing for that other defensive tackle spot. Barron playing in 2019 with the Alouettes, and then Michael Wakefield playing in 2019 with the Ottawa Red Blacks. Both pretty good players at defensive tackle. Those guys are probably going to battle it out for that other defensive tackle spot. And then Antonio Simmons, one of my breakthrough players of this season, really effective in the snaps he did get as a pass rusher. Didn't show up on the stat sheet as much as his presence was on the field from the eye test. So I think he's going to end up being one of their starting defensive ends here, and I think he's going to break out here. So really good 5-man unit there. And then you got the Canadian components of this group with David Menard and Junior Luke going to be battling it out to be, I guess, the ratio option there at defensive tackle. But it's all about whether or not they decide to start a Canadian defensive lineman. If they do, I think it's Menard, but it could be Luke. Those are really the two big options there. And then Dayton Jones, a guy that was actually a first-round pick of the Green Bay Packers way back, and he comes to the CFL after being out of the football for a while, so we'll see if he makes the team here and makes some noise. But an intriguing option to bring into camp nonetheless. And then Cameron Lawson and John Samuel Blanc, two guys that were draft picks in recent years and likely just trying to make the roster here. That's really going to be the big challenge. This is a pretty deep defensive line group. I don't know if they keep them all, so that's going to be what's going to be on the mind of those two guys. But overall, I do like this unit, and that's why it ranks 6th in the CFL. I just think that there's 5 units that are more complete, especially on the edges. I think the inside of this defense are very solid, obviously, with Sewell and Barron and Wakefield. Probably between those two guys, you get a really quality starter. On the edge, I think I just have a little more questions than I do have with other units. At linebacker, unfortunately, they're only going to rank 9th in the CFL. And the reason for this is obviously losing Haynock Mwamba this offseason in free agency. But you do have some interesting players here. Patrick Levels, the strong side linebacker, he actually, funny story, he plays for Montreal during the 2019 season, goes to Hamilton during the 2020 offseason, and then because they didn't freeze the contracts, 1 year ran off of his contract, and then he comes back and signs with Montreal this offseason, so he doesn't miss a game for the team, and he's going to play that role as that strong side linebacker. He's going to take his chances, and he did get beat quite a bit, and there's a reason why Montreal really got picked apart in the passing game last season. A lot of it was due to pass rush, yes, but I think there was a lot of secondary players taking liberty, and you can count a strong side linebacker as a secondary position. A lot of people do, and Patrick Levels has his moments. He can make a lot of highlights, but overall pretty good player, but just makes some mistakes sometimes that I think drag him down just below a lot of other strong side linebackers in the league. And then Chris Aki, a Canadian linebacker, probably going to play weak side for this team. Good in coverage as that weak side linebacker, has a lot of range, can actually play DB a little bit if you want him to. But the problem is he's not going to be a very good player in run defense, and he's probably just going to get run over by offensive linemen that get to the second level of the defense. So you give or take with Aki, but in terms of his coverage range, getting hands in passing lanes, and being effective at that, good player, and I think that's honestly more important at the CFL level, as I've stated a lot of times. And then you got a trio of 3 French-Canadian linebackers that they brought in through free agency. GM Danny Machocha of the Alouettes, he was a former coach for the Montreal Caravan in U Sports, and people are making jokes, oh, he's going to sign all of the French U Sports players, and he kind of did this offseason. And these 3 guys are primarily special teams players, and The special teams for this team are probably going to drastically improve this season because of all these additions, but I don't see any of these guys really factoring in terms of being starters for this team. And from what I gather, Kentrell Brothers is going to be the guy that is most likely to replace Haynock Mwamba in the middle of the defense. Comes to the CFL at more of an advanced age after playing in the NFL for a while and seeing some good playing time on defense there in the NFL. So we'll see if he takes hold of that role, but it's kind of hard to rely on that. And then Brian Haralamana, a guy that was a 2020 draft pick, I believe. One of the last two drafts, comes in as a rookie here. Could factor in. Who knows? Maybe he has a great camp. You never know with these guys. And then the three guys at the bottom, Jermaine Grace, Trey Watson, and Romeo Finley. I just put them on the screen just because they might figure in as starters here and you want to get familiar with the names, but don't know too much about those guys because their lack of experience playing at the CFL, they're all rookies. So this linebacking unit has a lot of questions, but at least they do have Levels and Aki who are decent CFL starters at least. Now, at defensive back, they're unfortunately also going to rank 9th, and this is going to be a short list of players because if I had included all of the American defensive backs that they're bringing to camp on this list, there would be no room on this slide. So the most notable player in this unit is Greg Reed, who had a really strong opening season in the CFL in 2019. Just a very effective player, a guy that rarely did give up big plays, and this was really the big problem for this defense last time we saw them. They were just getting gashed for the big plays in the secondary, but Reed was rarely the guy that was victimized for that. So he's my favorite player in this unit at that halfback spot. So I think it was very important that they were able to lock him up this free agency. And then Taekwon Glass came over from Edmonton in free agency in 2020 and is finally going to be able to make his debut this season. Pretty good CFL player, can start at corner, can play a little half here and there, but not really a impact player per se. And then Mo Shadrack Hunter, a guy that will make a highlight reel by making a big hit or whatever, so a lot of CFL fans know who he is, but this is not a very good all-around defensive back. Otherwise, he'll take his big risks and a lot of the time get burned for it. But he comes over from Edmonton as well, and we'll see how he does. Maybe he proves me wrong, but I don't think he was a massive part of the success of Edmonton in 2019 on defense. And then Najee Murray, a guy that kind of broke onto the scene at the end of the 2019 season. Just not a lot of experience there, so I'm not too confident one way or the other how his career is going to go, but just inexperience drags them down at that spot. And then Marc-Antoine Dequoy, a guy who was billed as the best U Sports prospect at defensive back in years when he came out in 2020, ran an electric 40-yard dash, was signed by the Green Bay Packers, and I think he's going to be a day one starter for this group. I honestly do. I think just because of the ratio situation that they may be forced to start one of these Canadian defensive backs, and I think he's the best option, and he could have an incredible rookie season in my opinion because he has the length, he has the athleticism to succeed. I'm really excited to see how this guy does on the field. And another former French-Canadian U Sports player that Danny Machocha scoops up here. And then Dominic Termanson, guy that's seen a little bit of playing time over the last few years, a little bit at corner, which is impressive a little bit just because it's hard to get on the field as a corner, as a Canadian in the CFL, but he was getting burned in a lot of the times that I did see him, so I don't think there's a lot there. And then Kerfalo Exame, another one of these French-Canadian signings, very effective special teams player with Winnipeg in 2019. One of those athletic guys that will really need to be coached up in terms of his techniques if he ever wants to transition on to a full-time role on defense. But I think there's a lot of potential there. But at the very least, you're getting a freaking monster on special teams. And then Ty Cranston, he actually may be the Canadian defensive back that starts here. He's been here for a couple years now. But I don't know what's going to happen there. He hasn't seen a lot of action, so there's not a lot to go off of there. But we'll see how that training camp battle goes. But I do think they're going to start a Canadian defensive back this season, and it's probably going to be one of these four guys. Now, on special teams, there are questions as well, and that's why they're going to rank 8th in the CFL. So we have a massive kicking competition for this group. So Felix Briere, Tyler Crapigna, David Cote, Joseph Zima, Matt Mengel. These guys are all going to be competing for this spot here on this roster, and I'm not going to spend too much time analyzing these guys because, I mean, they're kickers, right? So it's really hard to really deeply analyze what they do, but it's very important what they do at the same time, and the fact that they don't have a settled, established kicker. Corpina is the most experienced of these guys, but hasn't been as effective compared to other kickers around the league. So I'm very interested to see how this competition shakes out this season. And then Pierre-Luc Caron, your long snapper here, and then Mario Alford, your return man. There could be other guys that factor in here, such as Rashad Ross, but Alford showed a really competent ability to return kicks in 2019. So I'm really confident that he's going to be able to retain that role. But again, the kicking aspect is just so important to the Canadian game. With the 3 downs, you just see kickers more frequently, and not having that spot secured is a big red flag for me, and that's why it's dragged down to 8th in the CFL. Now, in terms of the projected starters for this team, there are a lot of question marks, and it was very difficult to try to put together some of these spots in the starting lineup. So we'll start in the receiving core, where, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of depth in this receiving core, so there naturally is going to be a lot of competition, but I think your 3 secure starters are Eugene Lewis, BJ Cunningham, and Namon Roosevelt. I think those 3 guys start for sure on day 1. And then I put Quan Bray in as the other American receiver in this offense. Again, I bold him here because you never know what's going to happen with his off-field issues, but he is the most talented of the guys remaining, in my opinion. You could see a guy like Dante Absher, Eli Rogers, or Jake Weineke starting here, but I put Quan Bray here for now, and a lot of these guys will be rotated in and out, right? But just in terms of the starting lineup, Quan Bray gets the start for me in this projected starters. And then Keon Julian Grant at wide receiver. I had some really difficult troubles trying to put together the Canadian starters for this team. Maybe not the first 5 or 6 guys, obviously, but in terms of that last position where they're going to start it, I put wide receiver here, but I don't feel too confident in that. You can see them starting at defensive tackle, but I thought they had more depth there. They also have a lot of depth at receiver, so I don't know where they're going to start this other Canadian, but they have to. Keon Julian Grant, a guy that has a lot of athletic potential, young player, was a relatively high draft pick. They may want to get him on the field here for a few starts. So I think maybe depending on the week, depending on the injury situation, it obviously will change for this team, but for now, I put Keon Julian Grant as a Canadian starter at wide receiver. On the offensive line, Tony Washington and Tristan Matt are your 2 for sure starters, but everybody else is kind of a competition. As I said, everything's kind of up in the air with these veterans that have shown mixed performances over the last few years. So I put Landon Rice at right tackle for now, but I don't necessarily think he's a starting caliber player at this point in his career. I think he's just kind of a placeholder here. They might start Foucault at right tackle, who has some experience playing tackle, and put Rice at right guard. So some of these guys are interchangeable, but there are questions about this unit. I don't think they're going to stray from starting 4 Canadian offensive linemen in this offense just because of the ratio situation elsewhere on the roster. It's not really the most complete Canadian roster in terms of potential starters. So I think they're going to start 4 Canadian offensive linemen. And then finally, Vernon Adams and William Stanback, obviously your starters at quarterback and running back. On defense, interesting as well. So I think the defensive line is pretty well set, except for defensive tackle with Michael Wakefield battling it out with Woody Barron for that last spot. I went with Wakefield here, but I think it's another one of those situations where it's a toss-up. And then in the linebacking core, I think Levels and Aki are obviously your starters, but then, as I mentioned before, the middle linebacker position left behind by Henoch Nwamba. I don't know what's going to happen there. I put Kentrell Brothers, who has the most pro experience out of these guys they brought in, but it's really going to be a true training camp competition that's playing out right now in Montreal. In terms of the secondary, Taekwon Glass, Monchedrick Hunter, and Greg Reed, the 3 experienced guys in the secondary, are for sure going to start, I think. And then Marc-Antoine Dequoy, I think it's between him and Ty Cranston to be that Canadian starter at safety. I think usually when you see a Canadian start at defensive back in the CFL, you usually see it at that safety position. So I think Dequoy is the pick here. And then Najee Murray, a guy that I think could get challenged by some of these other American free agents that they brought in here just because he has so little CFL experience and they may not trust him, particularly at that spot. So that is the big question for the American part of that secondary. Just really excited to see how some of these elements of this defense get sorted out as we get beyond training camp here. Now, the team award predictions is an area that I'm really excited to talk about with this team. So most outstanding player, I'm going with Vernon Adams, and I know this is like the third video in a row that I picked the quarterback to win the most outstanding player, but it's just the obvious choice in most cases. I think he's just the most dynamic player on this team. He's going to put this team on his back some weeks and be able to create some crazy comebacks that we were able to witness in the 2019 season. I think he's going to single-handedly keep them in a lot of games that maybe they otherwise shouldn't be in. And I just think that's really the definition of most outstanding player. And then most outstanding defensive player, Almondo Sewell, defensive tackle. I just think he's going to make a huge difference to the interior of that defense and really help build that pass rush that was really lacking in 2019. And then most outstanding Canadian, I'm going with Christian Matt, but you can go a lot of different ways with this because there are not a lot of true standout Canadians on this roster. I think you could go with Chris Aki as well. Maybe he has a good year at weak side linebacker, but I'm going with Christian Matt because just a really sturdy Canadian offensive lineman at center and has been a long-time veteran leader of this team. And then staying on the offensive line with the most outstanding offensive lineman, I'm going with Tony Washington, the left tackle. Has a hard job, but has done it really well throughout his career, and I think he's going to continue that this season. And then most outstanding rookie, as I've been alluding to, is Marc-Antoine Dequoy, who was a second-round pick in 2020, and I just think he's going to come in here and be one of the most impactful day one rookies that we've seen in recent years. Now, my final thoughts for the Montreal Alouettes going into the 2021 season. So the key question I have for this unit, and there could be a lot of different questions with this team because this roster has a lot of questions, but the biggest one for me is, can the Alouettes limit explosive plays against them in the passing game? This is really their Achilles heel in the 2019 season. You know, when you're thinking about the worst defenses in the league the last time the CFL played, probably thinking like, oh, maybe Toronto or Ottawa. No, Montreal actually had the worst pass defense last time we saw this team play and had next to no pass rush as well. So I think it was really a combination of the two things. I think the defensive line was really lacking and the defensive back room was just taking unnecessary risks and letting guys get behind them. Can they prevent that this season? That's really going to be the big question. I think if they get in a bunch of shootouts like they were in 2019, I don't know how many they're going to win because they were able to come back and steal a couple games that they really shouldn't have the last time we saw this team play. And that really leads me into my general prediction, which is that I think this team is a fringe playoff team this year. I think depending on how it works out with the crossover, I think they may not get in or they may get in. It depends on how it works out. I don't think there's likely to be a crossover this year in the CFL just because of the structure of the schedule in terms of how it's more division intensive. But I don't think this team is necessarily a lock for a playoff spot this season because there are holes in this roster I don't necessarily see with a lot of other teams. So we'll see how it works out for the Alouettes this season, but I'm really excited to see how they play. Vernon Adams, my favorite player, as I said, to watch in the CFL. Just so excited to see how he follows it up in 2021. But with that said, that is going to be the end of today's video, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank each and every one of you for watching. Once again, my name is Jason. If you want to support the show, the best way to do it is by hitting that like button and subscribing to Hussy Settle for more CFL content just like this. I appreciate all the support, and please let me know in the comment section what you think of this Montreal Alouettes roster going into this season. Who's going to be the standout players? Who's going to win most outstanding player? All of that. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.